Here today and online for our second panel of the day and our third panel of the summit. Over the next hour, we're going to be discussing pathways to work, opening new options and opportunities. And I'm delighted to have with me here Hobit Etchemizian, Maria Prieto, and Gary Workman, who are going to take us through this topic, starting from the subject of apprenticeships, which in line with our spirit for this conference, we are complementing the agenda and the headline topics being discussed at the International Labour Conference this week. So we'll be using that topic of apprenticeships as a jumping off point, and then talking more broadly about pathways to work and about how to provide innovative and effective avenues into employment for different populations around the world. And the implications that has for policymaking and partnerships. So thank you for joining us for the ride. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to Maria to give us a little intro. It's not her responsibility at the moment, but Maria, I would be very grateful if you could tell us a little about the discussion that's happening at the ILO this week on apprenticeships and what's at stake.
Okay, thank you so much, and very nice to be here. Let me start by saying that the quality apprenticeship discussion is this paper here that you might find in our webpage. It's the second year the discussion is going on, and the objective is to develop a standard, an ILO standard, in this case, a recommendation on quality apprenticeships. So what it includes, the discussion includes discussions on definitions, on the scope and means of implementations of apprenticeships around the world, a regulatory framework, what type of agreements, if they're written, if it includes leave, duration, etc. The issue of equality and diversity is also a very important point. The promotion of quality apprenticeships within systems, like, for example, lifelong learning systems and upskilling and reskilling systems. And then lastly, international, regional, and national cooperation for apprenticeships. Now, there are many bottlenecks that are still being discussed and negotiated between workers, employers, and governments. And our ILO Secretariat is supporting and giving as much information, etc., as possible to the discussion. So it will consequently come up with a recommendation that can be used globally, not only in the north or the south, but it's general recommendation. So thanks.
Thank you so much. I would like to hand over the floor to Gary, who's part of those negotiations over in the ILO, as representing the Global Apprenticeship Network, a coalition of business organizations working on apprenticeships. Gary, based on the work of your own organization, your members across Australia and GAN members globally, could you help broaden our thinking a little around this topic of apprenticeships? Because I think we often think of it as simply a first step for young people into work, and especially in particular industries and occupations. So maybe you could say a little around the breadth of your work on this subject. Thank you.
Thanks, Katrina, and thanks for the invitation. Yeah, look, the work of the quality apprenticeship paper over the last sort of 18 months, and even before that, the work that the ILO did on trying to highlight what is best practices and some of the work that they can identify in different parts of the world is really highlighted that the word apprenticeship, you know, in mature countries like Switzerland and Australia and the UK that have had apprenticeship systems for a long time, we have a conception that they're trades-based and they're for young people. But, you know, the developing countries have a very different view on what that might look like. And we've got all of these different cohorts that are experiencing disadvantage. What does it mean for them? And then we've got this overlay of an aging workforce and all this new technology and green technology that are coming into the system. So, in Australia, we have 500 different qualifications and pathways. When we talk to young people and parents, they could probably only name 10 to 15 traditional apprenticeship pathways. Like, they can all name electrical and plumbing and hospitality, automotive, but they don't realise that we've got opportunities in IT and the healthcare sector and education support and things like that. So I think that awareness piece really needs to follow up once we've got a framework globally and we can agree on the definition of apprenticeships and the regulatory framework. Then it's really an awareness piece about how do we get that information out. So I think from our perspective, we think an apprenticeship pathway is the ideal way for a lot of people. You're getting a qualification that's nationally or internationally recognised, you're getting experience and you're getting paid to do that all on the job and off the job training. So we think it's a great environment for all of those things to happen at once for young people.
Thank you. And you previously shared with me a couple of examples that I found really helpful. I'd love you to share them with the audience as well, of the work you're doing with Indigenous populations on one hand and women in construction. I think you shared with me those. Would you mind speaking a little bit to those as well?
Yeah, look, I think in Australia, we've got a really tight labour market at the moment. I think our unemployment rate's 2%, 3%, somewhere like that. So that is a really tight environment for us. And there's still a proportion of disadvantaged people there that are trying to get into work. So Indigenous in Australia, normally in the northern parts of Australia, sometimes are in environments where there's had intergenerational unemployment. So getting them back into thinking about work and those things are a lot tougher. So governments have actually started putting some policies together to try and, if government are investing in big infrastructure projects, how do we actually start to make sure that the employers are leaving a legacy locally? How do we actually make sure that we're using local materials, using local people, and providing them with the skills and qualifications, so when that project finishes, those communities are a little bit more sustainable. Those cohorts are a little bit tougher to work with, obviously. Our members get some really great results. Governments fund our members to work with the most disadvantaged in the communities. They expect high completion rates. They expect high participation. And that there's a lot of expertise that's needed to do that. So you can't look at these things in isolation. You've got to look at their family environment, public transport, housing, as well as education and sport and the background that they've come with. So you've got to be respectful in all of those situations. And then how do you actually bring, a group of supports to get them through a 4-year apprenticeship is the key in that space. And then when we look at women, again, we're actually tracking in a couple of our Victorian government programs, around about 23% of women in construction. The average in Australia is about 2%. So we're doing a lot better than that. What we find in our country, women make the decision to join an apprenticeship a lot later in life. They're not 17, 18, 19-year-old males. They're normally 25, 26, 27-year-old females. So they've got greater experiences in life. They've probably got other commitments in life. And then going back to an apprenticeship wage is sometimes a little bit tougher. We've got a little bit of work to do with improving the culture on construction sites, making sure that they're well welcomed and they're well supported. But we also have to look at if they're willing to make that change into a male-dominated industry, they can't be financially disadvantaged while they're doing that. So how do we actually support them to get through that at the same time? And how do we be more flexible? So they might have family commitments. Starting in the construction sector at 7 in the morning and working to 4 might not suit everyone when they're a little bit older. So we have to be more flexible. Our apprenticeship system's built off the European model, very traditional in some trades and licenses. And, I think the timing is right for us to look at part-time apprenticeships, a little bit more flexibility, having a look at wage support systems that can help other people get into and participate.
Thanks. That links to a piece of work that we've been doing actually with the Adecco Group, the Innovation Foundation at Adecco, looking at women returning to work after the pandemic. And we looked at flexibility as a starting point, but then as we've interviewed and spoke to more women, particularly women in the service sector and mid-skill women, so we're looking at like nurses and hotel workers, these kind of construction, these kind of industries, and found that flexibility is not necessarily the key. They do want different work patterns, but a lot of the time women are looking for predictability in their workplace, reliability of the environment, predictability in shifts, so that they can organize their other tasks. So I just thought I'd do a little pitch for our learning there, building on that topic. So it's actually called the myths of flexibility and choice, because it puts a lot on the women to manage that that additional element of what can be insecurity. But I think, yeah, the different working patterns are incredibly important for this population. Thank you. Speaking of different groups, Hovik, can I turn to you to share a little bit of your thinking and work at UNHCR with bringing refugees into the workplace, the kind of new pathways into work that you're exploring, and building what Gary said as well, the journey that refugees go through from entry, integration to being paid, you mentioned, as they enter into new workspaces. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting, because before coming to Geneva, I was mostly based on the African continent and the Middle East, part of our emergency response, and kind of the traditional humanitarian response pays a lot of attention to the immediate emergency needs. But then even as a few weeks after you start a camp, wherever you are, remember in Tunisia with the Libya crisis, we started a camp for refugees coming out of Libya. We had around 64 different nationalities in one camp. And I think one of the first things that emerged was businesses opening immediately, because people try to recreate a resemblance of normalcy wherever they are. And work is a very foundational element of creating that kind of dignified environment. So that's something natural. But us humanitarian organizations, we're not necessarily the traditional humanitarian response is not tuned to that. So we focus on the immediate delivery of aid, and then down the line we start looking at investments on the longer term. But the demand is there and has always been there. Now with the emergence of digital technologies and the digital market, digital economy, then takes yet another kind of magnitude, where you have in refugee communities very well-versed communities that want to be employed and work not only in the local economies, because a lot of times the local economies where refugees are, they are themselves trained. And so the digital marketplace opens opportunities that were not attainable before that. So not to be deaf tone and be kind of listening to the needs of refugees, we are embarking on this journey of opening those spaces for refugees to be integrated in a global digital economy. Now, it's, at face value, there's a lot of opportunities, but there are also challenges. So a lot of those refugee communities sometimes are not allowed to work locally. How do you translate that? Will they be allowed to work in the digital space? So that's part of, I would say, some of the challenges. A lot of times we have issues with connectivity and access to hardware, which we need to address as part of the challenges. You also have issues of upskilling. So how do you upskill communities so that they're able to compete in that market? To more of the kind of the job matching, which then becomes the exciting part, right? Bridging that gap between the global private and then the local displaced communities, and creating those synergies and labor platforms is one area that we're exploring on how do we bring refugee communities into digital labor platforms so they can do remote work? And then they need to be paid at the end of it. So how do you solve financial inclusion problems so that refugees can be paid? So it might look complex, but the reality is that there are many refugees now who are freelancing in the digital space. But that's very individual and ad hoc. So how can we, humanitarian actors and development actors and the private sector who is keen in looking into those skills that exist globally, to then tap into the wealth of skills that are either there or could be enhanced in displaced communities, and integrate those marginalized communities into a global economy. So it's a very exciting time. What I can say is that the demand is there. The issue is, how do we then make sure and enable that the demand for jobs meets the demand for jobs, meaning refugees want jobs and the companies want to recruit. How do we then bridge that gap? And I don't want to talk too much. So I want to give a cool example of something we did, which involves digital, but it was local. When I was managing Zaatari camp in Jordan, refugee camp for Syrian refugees a few years ago, as a camp manager, we had a camp of 5.2 square kilometers, kind of a city, around 80,000 refugees who are engineers. They have, IT people, carpenters and whatnot. So the skills were there. It was almost impossible to manage the camp because we would do infrastructure work and then refugees would come. The plumbers would then dig their own plumbing systems. And the electricians in the camp would extend from our electricity network into the private homes and provide that service to other refugees. So it was really impossible to manage the infrastructure. So we said, it's not that smart that we don't have refugees as part of our camp management team. So we hired a private sector company. I'm not doing any publicity here, but Esri, which is a leading global information systems company. We work with them to train a group of refugee men and women on global information systems. They became part of our camp management team. They were designing now the maps of the camp and then looking at services from a refugee perspective, using digital technologies to solve challenges. Not only did it work and it improved greatly our ability to do our camp management work, I was not there at the time, but I hear that the local city next door, which had urban infrastructure problems, now is using the services of refugees who were trained by us to deal with their urban planning issues. So I think this is to say the skills are there, just like they exist in any other non-displaced communities. It's about harnessing those skills, enhancing them, and matching. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What an incredible example and a nice inroad into our conversation after this panel on refugee employment in the digital space. So we're delighted to have Hovig joining us too. Maria, I think it's also a nice jumping off point to speak a little around the innovations happening in the policy space at the moment around apprenticeship, but really around youth engagement and youth voice. You mentioned earlier the impact of crisis and the crisis we've faced through COVID, the poly crisis we're facing now on kind of shifting gears a little in the policy space. So could you speak a little to that? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So of course, it has to be seen in obviously the current context that you were saying, the poly crisis, the new word that we're throwing around, basically saying that, well, COVID, geopolitical influences, wars, etc., and it's happening extremely fast. And the mega trends that we have been talking about, like technological change, demographic change, technology, are, yes, they're still there, but there are many others, like almost increasing exponentially, and we have to adapt a little bit to that in our work. And well, my area of work is youth employment in this context. And given the situation of youth that have been extremely influenced by all these crises that have been going on, and situation was already bad before the COVID pandemic, and now increasingly we're not talking only about unemployment, but we're talking about informality and underemployment and people that are not in education or training. So it's like it's not a very nice environment for the moment. And so the ILO, taking note of everything that's been going on, during COVID, we changed the strategy a little bit, or took a step towards changing the ILO strategy on how we worked with this particular cohort of young people that is normally defined as from 15 to 24, but that is like a flexible parameter. And the main message is that it has to be done through integrated programs and policies through our tripartite structure, employers, workers, and governments. So that is not a big change. There are several new or additions that are being strengthened, such as taking particular interest in the expanding social protection to youth, etc. But what is becoming more and more innovative or new in this sphere is that we used to talk about policy development for youth a little bit as a responsibility of young people, like you should get upskilled or train or an education, or you should, develop your entrepreneurship capacities, etc. And the shift now goes towards including in the policy some kind of level of responsibility to create a better future for the new generations in the labor market, and a better future that includes all the strengths that I've just mentioning, and also the new approaches that we're working with, like, for example, trying to support the development of lifelong learning, quality apprenticeships, etc., sort of taking that into consideration and accommodating, the digitalization angle and the greening of the economy, of course, which is something that is extremely important for the new generations. And the third, if you like, point is the youth participation in the development of those policies. And that's where I wanted to highlight a little bit in terms of engaging the voices of youth in developing policies and implementing them through programs that make sense for the new generations, and in consultation and monitoring with them. So we did some research together with the Graduate Institute on these issues, and it was found, among many other issues, that there was very little social dialogue that included youth, but there was such an desire of it being more, and that the actors in social dialogue would have wanted youth more involved in these discussions for obvious reasons. So that led us a little bit to thinking that it would be good to have a meeting, a tripartite meeting, as we have in the conference, but this time include youth to discuss the issues of how to include youth in the discussions for policy development. And we did this in November. And it was, for us, I mean, for the UN, maybe it's not a big issue, but for the ILO, it is quite a change from how we normally work, because we are added another layer to the discussion of the tripartite discussion. And there were several findings from this discussion. And one of the issues was that there was a certain urgency to recalibrate how we are operating social dialogue now, where workers and employers did insist upon the necessity to include youth in their ranks. That has to be said. And governments made a few suggestions on youth councils, etc., that already exist to discuss these issues, including apprenticeships and other important issues. But it was also noted that there was a trend that is a youth disconnect in society in general, that is also reflected in social dialogue. And it was also like if you wanted the conclusions, was that there needs to be a political will, for this to work. And this is something that we have seen during COVID, a little bit of a kick in that area. So creating that momentum. And there was a need to create a better mandate for social partners, for actors, workers, employers, to expand and develop methods, specific methods for youth to be engaged. And they can be, more innovative methods through social media and others. And that there was to expand cooperation and partnership between social partners and youth organizations as well, could be an option. And youth committees that I mentioned before, that already exist in many countries. But also, as a last comment here, I would like to highlight that youth is obviously not a cohort, a fixed cohort. We unfortunately don't stay young. I mean, with time we move on. So it's for the few years, and then so methods that are needed have to be extremely flexible to be able to sort of include the new generations. Yeah. So, for example, just to say I don't know if it's a cool fact, but it's a fact. When I have been in countries, and I will say which country, to meet youth representatives from our social partners, it has happened that the person that represents the youth cohorts was over 70. So, I mean, yes, I mean, the knowledge is fantastic, etc. But there is a need for the youth angle as well here that is extremely important to. And then lastly, the role of the UN and the multilateral system is extremely important to engage young people also at that level of the discussion, not only at local and national.
Thank you, Maria, from joining that event that you held in November. We're lucky that Maria Mexi, who works with us, is also a joint colleague and was helping to coordinate that. But the big highlight for me, apart from the energy and insight that was brought by these young people, was we often think of engagement of youth as employees, but this was really tripartite engagement of youth. So youth who are on the employer side, youth that are on the employee side, youth that are on the representation side, and hearing that debate amongst those different views from young people was really refreshing for me. Gary, I wondered if I could come back to you on we've been talking a lot about the needs of the worker in the apprenticeship space, but you're doing a lot of work to support the employers, because there are challenges for employers in being able to support those 4-year apprenticeships, the training needs that come for it, etc. Could you speak a little bit about the collaboration you're building in this space? I know Dean's also here as well, so if you want to chip in at any point, Dean Luciani, who's the chairman of the Apprenticeship Network in Australia, also please feel free.
Thanks, Katrina. Look, in Australia, we have a really unique model where an intermediary, like one of Dean's companies, is actually the employer of the young person. So they take all the risk away from small to medium-sized businesses that may not have the capacity or the volume of work over the next 4 years to take on a young person into a traditional apprenticeship model. So the group training model in Australia, and it's been debated the last couple of days at the ILO in terms of the exact role and terminology for intermediaries. But our members get some really great success, and they're taking the risk away from small businesses. They do the recruitment, they set the expectation for the employer and the individual. They support them through the 4-year apprenticeship, and then they'll rotate that young person to other employers as they need to over the 4 years. So there's a whole range of reasons why the rotation's needed. So they might not have the depth of work or the change of work that they need to get a fully rounded qualification. It might not be a great match between the individual and the employer. It could be an economic reason that things slow down in a particular region and they have to shift them to make sure that they continue in their work environment. So the model in Australia is quite mature. It's been around for 40 years. It's been interesting in Australia and other countries, the interest in this model in the last 4 or 5 years, because before COVID, we saw youth unemployment quite high in a lot of countries, and the mismatch that we were talking about earlier, where businesses are saying we've got skill shortages and people are saying, well, there's a whole heap of unemployed youth there that could fill those needs. Why isn't that match happening a little bit better? So we've been really encouraged that this flexible model is seen as a way to support small businesses and industries that may not have had a traditional pathway for apprenticeships in the past. We have some of our apprenticeships are 12 months, some of them are 4 years, quite different industries. And if you're dealing with small to medium-sized businesses, they might not have the skills to do and to support a young person initially. So, we always hear stories of older people like myself. They get frustrated with young people. There's some fantastic young people out there, and in one of my roles, we get to see them every year in our awards and everything else. But sometimes the older generation, they have frustrations that they probably don't understand how to communicate with young people, or there's a mismatch in expectations. So the young person has an expectation about this, and the employer has a very traditional old expectation of that. So how do we bridge that and bring them together and make sure that we get more people through to completion? And that's for all different people. So again, you've got to make sure you understand the issues really well, and you've got the support so you can provide them.
I think we can open to being prompted. We can open to questions on the floor, unless anyone wanted to react on the panel, any immediate reactions. Then do we have any questions in the room for our panelists or comments? One at the back. Oh.
Hi, sorry, we got a bit confused. Thank you for the panel and the perspective about how to have new pathways to work. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more about the digital market economy. And you mentioned briefly that there are challenges, but there are opportunities too. I'm trying to bridge to the next session as well. So I was wondering, what is the biggest challenge that you see when you talk about these new pathways to work and you talk about the digital marketing, like the first one that you have in mind? We can do a combined answer if that would be great. Like each of you, if I may ask, what is the biggest challenge to access the digital market economy when we talk about new pathways to work?
Thank you. Since it's for all three of you, let's take that one to start with, and then we'll see if there are more questions afterwards. Would you like to start, Jose?
Yeah, I'm gonna cheat and not give you the answer you want and pick one. I think there's a few major ones that we're facing, and I alluded to them. One is connectivity. And I think we have this impression that people are connected. But today there's 400 million people in the world who have zero network. So network hasn't reached them. There's another 3 billion who the network has reached them, but for a number of reasons, they don't have access to the internet. And for refugees and displaced populations, it gets a bit more complicated because then even legal access to SIM cards is an issue, which might not be an issue for local kind of residents of the country. So like there's an amplification of grievances or challenges when it comes to forcibly displaced populations and especially refugees. So connectivity and access to connectivity is a major issue. I think the second major issue is access to hardware and software. Again, not everyone has access to the economic even ability to get access to devices and licenses. So that's the second. I think access to skills is a third one that I could think of. The fourth one is, and I'm cheating, but I'm down with two. The fourth one is actually access to employers. So this idea that everything is online and you just go and look and find, I think that's a myth. This is why we have labor platforms and other modalities to do that match. And for refugees, the fifth element, which is also very key, is financial inclusion. So a lot of refugees don't have access to banking systems. They're financially excluded. So if you're financially excluded, how can you actually find a job and get remunerated for it? So that element is also extremely important. The solutions are not all technical and technological. There are also legal, political barriers. So I think the solution is a partnership between governments, private sector, international and local organizations to break some of these challenges and find solutions.
Can I take over from exactly what he said? So making a distinction first between digital and platform, which is digital economy is something much more broader, whereas platforms, we know what we're talking about. So looking at it from an ILO point of view, the ILO has had discussions and an expert meeting on the subject to discuss platforms. And obviously, we do have the division between employers and workers concerning regulations. And this has been something that has stopped a little bit, or have not stopped, but delayed a bit the discussion. So the next discussion in the conference on the subject of regulation for platforms, that is one of the main bottlenecks, I think, on top of everything that has been said, will be discussed in 2025. And by then, we would be able to have some understanding at that level, governments, workers, and employers.
I think we really have to balance that space. So Hovig raised some really good issues there. So some of the most disadvantaged people in the community don't have the same access that others do. We've also, if we're dealing with small businesses and older owners of businesses, they may not be willing to change as well. So I think most young people in the developed countries are impatient. They want more digital technology. They learn that way. They get their information that way. there's got to be a balance there for everyone in that space. I think one of the things we've also got to be mindful of is a lot of our qualifications and training is sometimes slow to react to changes in technology. So how do we make sure that the curriculum is kept up to date as quickly as possible? Because that is one of the challenges for employers. They won't engage unless they're getting the right skills when they need them. So our curriculum development is slow, even in countries like Switzerland, where we think it's one of the best apprenticeship models in the world. They complain that embedding new technology and new systems into the curriculum is a slow process. So if we want to engage more employers, that's probably the starting point to make sure that we've got our leading technology there embedded into what we're educating people with. And then how do we improve the hardware and the ability for everyone to connect? Again, I think governments need to play a bigger role in that space. If we're moving that way, then governments probably need to take a lead.
I think you had another point.
Yeah, there's actually two more points that I missed. One is the marginalized within the marginalized communities. And the moment you go into that, you see how people are even more disconnected. And so, and investments are expensive. So we, as part of our kind of digital innovation, we did a digital boot camp for refugees with hearing and eyesight impairments to see how we can include them in dialogue online. It was a 2-hour session, and it took us months of preparation and also hiring technologies, but also humans to help assist. So the moment you go into the most vulnerable amongst vulnerable communities, then investments are even needed that are higher than, I would say, for the rest of the population. So that's something that we need to be mindful of if we're serious about inclusion of those who are the most vulnerable in the kind of digital economy space. So that's kind of, I think, one element to grapple with as we move forward in the digital space, basically. And then the second thing is digital risk and scamming. In that space, there's a lot that is happening. And the moment you go into the space communities, people impersonating international organizations to scam in the digital space, especially if you're looking at sources of revenue, income and whatnot, we can see that that is on the increase. So how do you manage that digital risk, and how do you work with communities for digital literacy, but also digital literacy on risk factors is also, I think, important. If you go gung-ho on digital and you're not mindful of the vulnerable and you're not mindful of the risks, your programming could be flawed.
Yeah, that is a great comment. We had a similar one in the breakout discussion earlier, talking about the huge surge of digital activity, even in the e-commerce space since COVID-19. Things like the example that was raised earlier was hawker stalls, hawker owners. That's like for food stalls and food markets have previously been resistant to digital payments. And then there was a huge surge during COVID. And the newest entrants to the market are the least savvy, I suppose, in this digital risk space. So the faster we scale, the higher those risks are going to be in that transition. So we've been talking about transitions through the 3 days. Thank you for that. Do we have any other questions?
Okay.
On the way.
Okay, thank you so much for this very interesting discussion and insights, sharing your insights with us. My question is mostly addressed to Mr. Workman. Policymakers and trade unions usually complain that the private sector is not doing enough in terms of promoting or investing in quality apprenticeship systems. How do you comment on that? Thank you.
I probably don't disagree. We've written papers in Australia saying that employers need to step up and do more. They need to create the opportunities for young people. But I can also see their side, that they're frustrated that the curriculum's slow, that technology is not working for what they need in their business. We need to remember that their core business is running, whether they're building houses or they're, helping people in the health sector. Their core business isn't training and educating and supporting. So it's how do we actually help them do that more? We were really frustrated after the global financial crisis because a lot of employers moved away from the traditional employment models and the gig economy and outsourcing labour and going off to offshoring to countries where labour is cheaper. Employers looked for the simplest answer to improve their business model. They didn't want to invest in building the skills and the workforces they needed in the future. And then COVID hit, and all of a sudden, they can't rely on all of those cheaper ways of employment. And then they talked about sovereignty and how do we rebuild our skills locally and how do we protect our businesses. So they can't have it both ways. We would really like employers to invest more in their local economies, local communities, be good corporate citizens, then everyone wins. It's not always about the biggest profit margin. If you want a sustainable business, you have to think a lot more holistically these days.
Thank you. I think it's a question at the back or online question. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, and thank you for this fantastic panel. I just had a question. It's a bit of a follow-up to the question before, which is that considering the multiplicity of labor and industrial cultures that create very different willingness by the private sector to engage in quality apprenticeships, do you think there are particular skills that young future apprentices should be equipped with before becoming apprentices, so as to ease the case for the private sector being more involved into successful, quality, and also perhaps future-looking apprenticeships? And those don't necessarily need to be technological, but they could be.
Yeah, and we get this question a lot. I think your personal attitude plays a big part in all of this. When we talk to employers, if you have the right young person with the right attitude, willing to learn and get the full scope of what the job entails, that's all the employer wants. The skills can come and they're happy to be patient and build those skills over time. When we talk to a lot of young people, I think that's the number one message we give them. Don't listen to the outside noise. All of those things will come over time. And a lot of parents and career advisors and other people that haven't gone through an apprenticeship model always think something's better elsewhere, but you've got to have the same attitude no matter where in life. And again, I think from an apprenticeship, we underestimate the value of where that can take you. I know there's a lot of CEOs around the world that started their career in an apprenticeship. If you get the basic understanding and the concepts of how to do those skills, then you progress over the career of your life. And everyone's going to progress at different speeds, different times. I get a little nervous when policymakers say, oh, everyone's going to change careers 17 times in their life. Like that just scares young people going, oh, am I doing the right thing today? Like I think people with the right attitude, set the right expectations between your employer and yourself, set career goals, be positive. I think all of those key traditional things still hold up very well today.
Would anyone else like to come in on that question?
I wanted to also throw in another trend, and that to the digitalization one, and that is artificial intelligence. I have been trying out ChatGPT. I don't know if you all have done so, and we understand all that enormous influence that will have on this discussion. So this is something that I believe we'll be starting to work on, at least from our side, and I'm sure from everybody's.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. Less of a question, more maybe to add to some of the dialogue. In terms of apprenticeships, it is a partnership and a balance between the needs and the wants of both the apprentice and the employer. And I think we need to put a little bit more focus on industry and what industry should be doing for themselves, and perhaps some more support networks, as Gary mentioned before, around employers themselves. So in Australia, about 65% of all apprentices are employed by SMEs. And I heard a stat from the ILO yesterday that suggests globally 90% of apprentices are supported or employed by SMEs. So if you take a young person, for example, entering their first job, and you team them up with an SME who may be employing an apprentice for the first time, what could possibly go wrong? And obviously I'm being facetious there, but at the end of the day, we do need to consider now supporting and training and making more responsible industry and employers of apprentices. Every time we see a completion or a non-completion, an apprenticeship fail, we start to say to ourselves, what did the apprentice do wrong? How could we have better prepared them? Is that attitude the right attitude? But in half the cases, it's actually an issue with the employment arrangement as well. So, and I know in Australia, there's some significant moves afoot to start to regulate and support employers of apprentices, because it is a balance and it is a partnership, and it requires support and it requires a commitment on both sides. So I think we need to start to take a more balanced view. And in terms of, you know, the global scene, I think we also need to be more open around apprenticeships being transferable. It's a small world, and young people want to travel, and most of the time they're buying one-way tickets. So, you know, we're not keeping up. The apprenticeship system's thousands of years old, and it's not keeping up with young people and what they need and what they want moving forward. So there's a bit of self-reflection for us as employers and as industry. And rather than industry say, what's government doing to fix this problem? And rather than government saying to industry, what are you doing to fix this problem for yourself? I think we need to sort of do more of perhaps what's happening at the moment, where we get everybody involved in a conversation to at least set some minimum standards so we have a starting point moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been speaking about portable benefits, so now we need portable apprenticeship programs as well. I wonder, sorry, I put you on the spot while you're coughing. I wonder if you face the same thing around employers and raising awareness of some of the challenges and needs for the employer side around refugee access to employment.
Thank you. No, actually, it's part of, I think, when I was talking about the digital risk, I think that there's the element of the ethics of employment and rights. And this is an area where the power dynamics are a bit even more skewed and the risk is higher, because whereas, you know, country nationals, depending on where you live, and enjoy at least certain protection under the rule of law and rights as citizens. The moment you go into displaced communities, then the issue of access to rights a lot of times is in question or challenged, and then avoiding. I mean, as we go into the digital economy, of trying to make sure that the employment is ethical is something that we're working on, but this is something new also for us. And we are working actually with ILO in a number of countries under the Dutch support to unpack this, to work with both communities, governments, and also employers to establish ethical and human rights-based parameters of employment for marginalized communities and displaced populations. So it's an area of great interest and focus, but it's also an area of exploration for us. I think from my exchanges with employers, there's a recognition of that from the onset, but I think recognition is one thing and putting that in practice is another. So I think it's an area of, I would say, opportunities, but also management of risks. Did I answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks. I'm glad I asked. I saw a couple more hands earlier.
Thank you to everyone for such an interesting panel. I think my question is mostly related to the case study brought from UNHCR Action, in which people who are part of refugee communities were equipped with digital service training to allow them to bring their existing skills to meet camp needs. And I was just wondering about that in terms of participation. Did you see fairly equal participation in terms of gender ratio? If that wasn't the case, how would you characterize labor as you see it within refugee camps? And when thinking about pathways towards a digital world of work, does this place provide opportunities to ensure gendered inclusion in a new space? And what conditions might better allow that?
Can I answer that question? I think it's directed to. Very good question. Interesting, because first is the whole inclusion agenda, whereas our intentions are global in nature. So everywhere we go, everywhere we work, that agenda is there. The tactics of achieving that agenda are different depending on the local context and the local governance structures that we deal with and whatnot. But in that example, what was very interesting is that what we started as a program that was linked directly to the services in the camp. First, we did train men and women. So the kind of the gender dimension, I know it's not restricted to men and women, but let's say in that context, we did have gender diversity included. What was though interesting is that whereas this started as a pure services management undertaking, what we realized from working with the community is that maps that they produce on the services were mostly used. I have just 1 minute in plural, actually. That's like many minutes, right? It's 1 minute. So, so what we uncovered is that the maps were utilized mostly by men, so male refugees, whereas the services were mostly utilized by female women in the camp. So what started as, and I think it's part of the fact that we had a diverse team of refugees who were trained, who then went and looked at the usage of these maps in the camp and kind of unpacked how a camp management form of refugees can drastically improve the way business is done in the camp. But then we uncovered this, why is it? And then it goes back to the use of smartphones. Who has the smartphone in the house? Who is monopolizing the use of the smartphone? You can guess. So absolutely, you open that inclusion door, then you have an anthropological study that leads you towards many avenues for potential change. So the gender lens, we wear it, but then it is what is very interesting is to unpack that in communities and address that with great flexibility. So knowing that information, of course, allowed us to adjust and kind of look into kind of different ways, including, and this is part of the reason why we're investing in things like, well, we need to solve connectivity problems. We need to solve access to hardware problems, including smartphones, because you can deduct from your study that, well, men are using the smartphone in the house, but also in many households, you have many smartphones. So why is it that you have, okay, please close the session. I have to stop talking. That's so rough.
Thank you.
I'm done.
Well, we're going to hear more from you shortly. Thank you so much to all our panelists. Did you have any last burning thoughts that you'd like to share? If not, I will say a huge thanks for broadening out this topic for us, really helping us to think of it from the changes that are happening in societies at the moment, which are pushing us to think of new avenues of engagement, the demographic shifts amongst young people and the need to keep on top of youth engagement and youth voice, the roles and the challenges faced on either angle, from the government to the workers' apprenticeships themselves, to the companies and sustaining these apprenticeships and the collaboration that's needed around that. I definitely feel better informed on this topic, and I hope it sparks a great conversation going forward. Thank you all so much. Thank you to everyone in the room and online. We have a 30-minute break coming up on our agenda, followed by a topic breakout session building on this topic around digital work for refugees. It seems like there is space for conversation there. So do join us in half an hour. Thank you.